I have to say that I didn't know of Peter Linebaugh when we started to put this together, to my shame. Michael Radcliffe says that outside of Canada, Peter Linebaugh is one of the most important, if not the most important, historian around who doesn't play the banjo. But in all other respects, Peter Linebaugh is exactly consonant with the values of the NLG and what the Commons is all about. We've brought him in from the University of Toledo, where he is a professor of history, but I will say that the things that impressed me the most are the fact that he has taught at Harvard and at Attica Penitentiary. He has taught at NYU and the Federal Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois. So this is a man who teaches what he believes, walks the talk, and practices what he preaches. He's the author of the books that we have outside. We have different sets of books, as you know, which are going to be, if you haven't been buying them now, they're going to be available for sale, and you should buy them. Laura Nader's book, Mark Lair's book, and also Peter Linebaugh's book, which are all going to be available at the law school. And I will say one last thing, two last things, I'm lying here. He's a long-standing member of the Midnight Notes Collective. If you don't know what that is, you ought to go to your browser and look up the Midnight Notes Collective. And also note that he's lectured in Brazil, South Africa, Italy, Germany, the UK, and Ireland. And now, for the very first time, we have brought him out to Seattle, where Professor Linebaugh has never been before. And we're bringing him out to grace this particular session.
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve. It is true. I've not been to Seattle before, and I'm very glad to be here and I was very glad to hear the songs, because the songs certainly have gone around the world, and they make me feel right at home with the international working class. So I'm very happy to hear these songs. Good. Steve didn't say that I'm a bit jet-lagged, and I'm taking courage from Laura's talk earlier today when she said she was not going to give a linear talk. That'll be true for me as well. I'm going to have to jump around to various things, and I'm just going to throw them out, and maybe they'll come out later in different ways. There are definitely some major points that I would like to make, and I think I want to stretch. It's been a long day, and for those of you, yeah. So I think I do want to provide some information that may be useful for you as practicing lawyers. You know, Steve, I taught at Attica in the 80s, and I taught at the Federal Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois in the 1970s. So that was quite a while ago. I think it's much more difficult to teach in prisons now. This is a principal institution for our future. As the budgets for schools have gone down, we know those for prisons have increased. Our young people end up, and the future generation ends up learning in prison at a much higher degree than any other country in the world. And our knowledge of that pedagogy is sorely deficient. I was really impressed by the picture of the sturgeon. Do you remember that? The huge creature. When Tom Paine was born in January 1737, on that same day in the Little Ouse River in Norfolk in England, they captured a sturgeon that was over 7 feet long. I just wanted to put that down. It's something that came to mind. The talks have really been interesting, and I'm scared. The talks have been scary for me, there's so much economics, then here I am, I know this is the place for programming and internet. And, I feel very small, very little compared to you guys. And then the talk about that blew me away. But I was glad he mentioned some bits from British history. That made me feel good. Perhaps there's some overlap. I was very glad to meet Laura and her love of Oaxaca, where I had been recently. I've gone 3 times to see friends in Apo there. That's the Assembly for the Peoples of Oaxaca. It's a grassroots organization that's met a kind of repression mark that's very similar to what you showed us in Vancouver over the years. And so I've learned a lot from the Democrats of the city of Oaxaca, and I've learned a lot from Mexico and from Subcomandante Marcos, who in 1994 called for the restoration of human rights for the indigenous people of Mexico and called for Magna Carta. And as an English historian, I couldn't understand why he was doing that because I wasn't a very good English historian, and actually I'd never read Magna Carta. So really it took the Zapotec people and the different indigenous people of Chiapas to bring it to my attention that this might be a document that they considered important. But never mind, it was all based on a misapprehension to begin with, a problem of translation, because Subcomandante Marcos was talking about the Carta Magna, not the Magna Carta, and the Carta Magna refers to the 1917 Mexican Constitution, which was a different kettle of fish altogether. But so I felt left off the hook. But then I got interested in it anyway. I was in Toledo, Ohio, and our representative there, I forget her name, voted against the NAFTA treaty. You remember the North American Free Trade Treaty? And its precondition was that Article 27 of the Carta Magna be removed, be abrogated, be rescinded. And that's the article of the Mexican Constitution that really recognized the struggle of the campesino, the Mexican people of the early 20th century, because the ejido in the village is the village commons. So after all, it had some interest to me. But too late, I'd already gone back and looked at the Magna Carta for my British history. I would like, before I'm done today, to say why the 11th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica is not the good basis for our future investigations of the Commons. And I also would like to teach us all a poem, and I want to teach who was it who said we had to be weird? That came up, didn't it? Was that Professor Rogers? All right, I definitely want to join that. And a way of doing that, I think, is to get in with some medieval terminology. So I hope we can have a little bit of medieval terminology before the day's over. And then there is a bit of work that I'm going to ask us to do that goes with, again, with a talk that Professor Nader gave us. However, I did want to mention, is Professor Tan here? Yes. Was that the 98th meridian? I look forward to looking at a map. My grandfather, well, my dad is from Oklahoma, he's from Muskogee. But my grandfather was a Choctaw Indian person who had lost their lands under the 1887 Dawes Act, communal lands in Oklahoma. I didn't know any of this. My father and so on was, it's kind of the racism within the family, wanted to hide this background as a source of shame, of course, because it's not that he lost the land, he lost his parents. Because what happened is that to get the land, they would say that the parents were unsuitable for the children. They'd take the children away from the parents and stick them in Anglo families, which has happened to my grandfather, and grew up in Atoka, Texas. So I find myself speaking to you about the commons in a way that I didn't know I was going to when I first read Magna Carta a few years ago because of Subcomandante Marcos. His name was Hayden Linebaugh, and he went on to become an attorney and actually had pleadings before the United States Supreme Court in the 1920s on behalf of Indian oil claims in Oklahoma. I don't know much more about it than that. I never met him, so I don't have any warm, personal memories. Nevertheless, I feel that's a kind of amnesia and a kind of American family that, I don't think is unique. I think it's true of many of us. And coming here to Seattle, besides thinking of the Wobblies and Gary Snyder's grandfather, who used to soapbox down at Yearsley Square, do you say? The square here in Seattle, where in the olden days he'd get on a soapbox. Yesler, I'm sorry, Yesler. Oh, good. But I had read Sarah Winnemucca's autobiography. Do you know that? Man, have a show of hands. Ah, good. 2 people, that's something. I think, I hadn't read it either, It's short. And of course, like Olaudah Equiano, there's all kinds of controversy about whether she wrote it or not, or whether some, Anglo school teacher in Boston helped her out with the syntax and spelling. But anyway, she was a Paiute Indian woman. So I wanted to mention her name while I was here. Not put any woo-woo in it, but she'd gone to Washington, D.C., on account she couldn't find her band or some of her people, ended up in, I think, in this state, the state of Washington, and it was wintertime and they were cold. She, meanwhile, was over there in D.C., and from the Secretary of Interior at the time, who was a socialist from Germany, a 48er, but he'd come over here and done all right, he sent her a letter saying, yes, we'll send you some blankets. And she took that letter back over to this part of the world, not to Washington or Seattle, but to the Rockies and whatnot. And she called it the Paiutes Magna Carta. This was Sarah Winnemucca, and she never did get the blankets. So I think, what I'm trying to evoke is some personal and actual and local relations to the subject of the commons. And that for me as a historian, my approach to it has not just been something over in England, nor has it been, nor have I yet attained the distance of the lawyer, the social scientist, the economist, as I approach the subject. But it's, as I was reading Gary Snyder, as I mentioned him, this book, The Practice of the Wild, because I'm interested in the traditions of commoning that exist on the western part of the continent. And what you will have things in You will share traditions here or attitudes which in the Great Lakes region and also on the East Coast are less familiar. And so that's why I picked up Gary Snyder, who has an eye to Japan, to Alaska, to many parts of the world which are more accessible, I dare say, and the human thoughts and traditions available to you here in Seattle than to me in Detroit or Toledo or before that on the East Coast. Yeah, let me get on with this right away. I'd like to quote from Gary Snyder. There is a well-documented history of the commons in relation to the village economies of Europe and England, he writes. In England, from the time of the Norman conquest, the enfeoffed knights and overlords began to gain control over the many local commons. Legislation, he refers to the Statute of Merton of 1235, came to their support. From the 15th century on, the landlord class, working with urban mercantile guilds and government offices, increasingly fenced off village-held land and turned it over to private interests. The enclosure movement was backed by the big wool corporations who found profit from sheep to be much greater than that from farming. The wool, okay, and he goes on. And it's good. You know, what he has to say, I think, is, I don't dispute. But I would like to add a methodological principle, which I just have my roundabout way of enunciating. You know John Berger, the European playwright, poet, essayist. He says our era is an era of the wall. And he describes not the wall between the USA and Mexico, but he describes the wall that in Palestine, that the Israelis are building through Palestine. A wall of incarceration, of division, of fragmentation, of oppression. So, in my English history way, you know, I think of Midsummer Night's Dream, because that's where, you remember, the clown, Bottom, puts on a play, and he acts as the wall. Do you remember this? Bottom's the wall. This thought just occurred to me on the airplane, flying here. So I didn't have Shakespeare on hand to get the actual text. But when I saw it played, I think Bottom was like this. And then there was one lover here and one lover there on different sides of the wall. Like maybe they were both Palestinian. Anyway, Bottom had sympathy for that. And so he made his fingers go like this, that there was a space in the wall. I think they refer to it as a chink, you know? So that's I think, history from the bottom up. And what I mean what I mean to say with that is that Gary Snyder is only looking at the wall. He's not looking at the chink in the wall. And I think I want to introduce my methodological principle here is that of antagonism, that of contradiction, that the forces of the landlords in the 13th century is true, were very powerful. And the Statute of Merton, it is true, was a Parliament was an edict of enclosure. But you will not look in that statute for the chink in the wall. I'm not saying that Magna Carta, any more than the Carta Magna, is a document for us to build our future. That's our task. But I would like to say that if we want, as we build our future, along the lines that our speakers today have outlined for us, with the principles of cooperation and of sharing and of equality that have brought us to this conference, if this is the future we aim to make, then I think the chink in the wall and Magna Carta can help us out. It's on our side. It was not a Declaration of Independence. It was not a Communist Manifesto. It was not a rights of man and the citizen. It wasn't a UN universal thing of rights. It was an armistice in a class war. You give a little, you take a little. It's a class war. It's a war between the church and the state. It's a war between the monarchy and the barons. It's a war between Christians and Jews. It's a war between merchants and serfs. It's a war between commoners and privatizers. This is the civil wars in medieval Europe that this Magna Carta on June 15th, sought was an armistice. It was a deal. Do you follow me? So we're not going to find in it, the great principles, but nevertheless, people have fought for the centuries from then until recently. The ruling class has wished to have Magna Carta on its side, and working people throughout the British Isles have sought to find in it principles and ideas on its side. Yeah. So, Gary, I'm not saying Gary's without the principle of contradiction and antagonism. I think he knows this very well, perhaps better than I do. But I am saying that when he remembered his grandfather talking the class war, down at Yesler Square? What? Yesler, down at Yesler Square, I think he left that behind. Gary left that behind a bit too soon. And I think, if I follow Mark correctly, he wants us to remember it, to see whether in that class war we have a future. Certainly we have the class war now. And how are we going to get out of it? I don't know. I got a little scared today, with the climate change and the internet and all this. I got a little scared. So I can't do it by myself. I like that song, Side by Side. I need people on either side of me. You know what I'm saying? We got to think this thing through. We got to do it with some actions. But I think the capitalist imperialist system is bankrupt. And back in the day, Steve, back in Attica and so on, we used to laugh at the lawyers. And now, look, here I am. Yeah, you laughing at me. I know. Well, I'm talking Magna Carta, for Christ's sakes. This was the bourgeois rights. It was great to hear about the Black Panthers today. Number 5 of the 10-point program was truth in education. Number 9 was housing. Number 7 was a jury of our peers. That's the Panthers' 10-point program. It's just what I remember because, well, you know why. because it all overlaps with Magna Carta, doesn't it? Laura told us about Judge Bremer moving over there to, or he's not judge, was he? No, that Bremer moving off to Iraq. You know, Paul Bremer, his edict number 39, you quoted, privatized the resources of Iraq. Well, again, I like that because it ties in with Magna Carta. Because that's the principle in Magna Carta. It's 63 chapters. The 39th one is the one we all had to learn in school. I didn't. I told you earlier. So I generally end up having to read it. But I won't read it. It says, "No free man shall be exiled or destroyed or imprisoned without judgment by his peers, according to the due process of law." And we generally, in the centuries since, the principle of habeas corpus, or that writ as a writ of individual freedom, the principle of trial by jury, which I think is probably maybe the most efficacious from that period of time. It's certainly the one where women are most centered. It's certainly the one on the planet around the world which is most central to the preservation of the commons in the era of the feminization of poverty. The 39th chapter of Magna Carta also prohibits torture. And it has the phrase due process of law, which we find in our, I say our, in the USA Constitution, 5th Amendment and 14th Amendment. I scorn a little bit there because that phrase has been used to treat human beings as property and to treat property as human beings. You know, I'm referring to what the Dred Scott decision on the one hand, the slaughterhouse cases on the other. So the Supreme Court is very tricky with this Magna Carta thing, and I'm not recommending it wholesale. I'm just saying that if we want, we can use it. And here's how I propose to use it. It was lost. You know, King John, he didn't have his fingers open like that, a chick in the wall. On the contrary, he had them crossed behind his back. And as soon as he got off of the island in the River Thames, the Runnymede, he resumed civil war. Sadly, he died. The story of his death is instructive, and I love to tell it. He was riding with his baggage in the Wash. That's the part where the tide comes up over near Lincolnshire in England, and all his baggage was lost, and he got all wet. He went to Swinestead Abbey and demanded entrance, and they warmed him and invited him to dinner, and he said, "How much is this loaf of bread?" And they replied, the monks did, 1 penny. Before the year is out, it'll be 12 pence, he said. And there was a monk at the back who quietly said to himself that his time and hour had come. He went to the king, King John, and said, "Sire, would you like a sweet?" That's the English way of saying a dessert. And he said yes. So the monk went out into the orchard and plucked plums, removed the pit, and inserted poisonous venom, and took the plums to the king. And King John looked at him suspiciously with a cruel and wicked intent in his eye and said, "You eat first, monk." So the monk took a plum and ate it. Nothing happened. The king took a plum and ate it. And he was enjoying this novel flavor. And the monk turned blue, swelled up, and fell down dead before the king's eyes. And the king followed. And that's the story of the death of King John. That's a suicide bombing from the 13th century. Plums, of course, were from Syria. Been brought over by entrepreneuring crusaders. Anyway, the Magna Carta was lost as a parchment, and a young 9-year-old became king. Civil War is still going, but on the 11th of September, 1217, there's a Treaty of Kingston, also in the River Thames. And by the way, I just learned this island at Kingston has been taken over by environmentalists last week. I haven't studied the emails of it yet, but I can't wait to write them and let them know that it was on that island that it insisted there could be no treaty unless the Magna Carta were recovered. It didn't have that name, by the way. It's just called the Charter. And they did find it, and they brought it back. But it had changed. Article 7 had changed. And Article 7 included, let me just get this really right. And she shall have, in the meantime, her reasonable estovers in the common. Hot dog. There we are, Steve. The Commons in Magna Carta, Chapter 7, 11th of September, 1217. Good, huh? Well, estovers. Let's get into estovers. All right, estovers. Estovers is the oil of that time. The widow can go into the woodlands and collect wood for the purposes of fuel, for the purposes of cooking, for the purposes of repairing her habitation, for the purposes of constructing tools. These are estovers. They have local meanings. They do not have legal meanings. This is the livelihood of human beings at that epoch. They did not look to the state. They took direct action, and that direct action was customarily agreed to by the members of the community who would do the policing, Mr. Garrett Hardin, thank you very much, on their own. They are commoners, and commoners, as the world knows, are quarrelsome. It is not the peaceable kingdom. Commoners are always quarreling. Oh, that's this armrest, that's for me, not you. You know, there's little elbow wars that go on. But we manage without having to be policed about whose elbow goes where, you know, whether it's in Piggott Hall or on the Boeing that was coming home from Detroit to Seattle and brought me the other day, you know, where there was some elbow wars with a fellow who's going on a ski holiday. But, you know, we ended up chatting. Us guys on airplanes have a hard time talking. Or at least, anyway. Okay, that's estovers. Chapter 7, Magna Carta. And so I just apply that to oil. You know, that's the hydrocarbon energy resource. They say the woodland era is over, the coal era is over. I don't think so. I think we can have estovers now. I mean, the women in the Escravos Delta, you know, in Nigeria think so. They show their bare bottoms to shame the men who take the money from the big oil companies. I think this estovers has, you know, we can Do something with it. You can, as lawyers. The Supreme Court likes the Magna Carta. I think judges like it. It's the Anglo law, right? You can, I realize there's many traditions, but I'm just speaking of an indigenous tradition in England, where they have indigenous people too, who've been there for a while, and, the Monty Python type, and they carry on with these customs. And there's no reason why us, in our American ways, cannot just bring that to court as well, in my opinion. But you would know that better than I. But also the Charter of the Forest, as Lou was telling us this morning. The Charter of the Forest came on 11 September 1217 as well. And that's the charter that includes pannage in it. Here's word number 2. Pannage, that means you can put your pigs in the forest and fatten them up in the fall on the acorns and the mast. And this way, a protein for a family can be obtained. I'm saying you don't own the forest, you see, but you can use it for these purposes. And I'm also saying it's local. And I'm also saying that there's local assemblies where women are active to prevent the feminization of poverty. I'm not saying I want to live at that time. They didn't have showers. Okay, I mean, we live in our time. I'm not saying let's go back to medieval times, but I'm saying that human beings have created ways of dealing with, of commoning. And this is what, Steve, twice today you've referred to this beautiful slogan of the National Lawyers Guild of human rights are ahead of property rights. But I think this commoning mixes them up somewhat. And the human rights and the property rights go together. This is what I found out thanks to Subcomandante Marcos and my idiotic mistakes about the Carta Magna, because it all came up with President Bush. When President Bush went to the United States Congress, and there was Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of England, up there in the balcony, and I'm going, oh boy, I'm going to have an early dinner and I'm going to watch this. This is going to be good. It was on October, you remember, 2011. And we'd had, I think, about 10 days or 2 weeks of really, national, for the first time, speaking about a campaign to reduce hubris. I think there was a moment there. Do you remember that grievous moment when we were wondering, because we're all New Yorkers, you know what I'm saying? And we're thinking, who do we know? And oh dear, and we began thinking. It was a beautiful moment in American history. But in a way, it came to an end on that speech. Because President Bush was pretending he was Roosevelt, and he was pretending that Tony Blair was Churchill, and he was saying, let's pretend we're in World War II again. Let's fight for freedom. Okay, what's that? Oh yeah, freedom of speech. Yeah, freedom of religion. Okay. And I'm looking around at the white hairs. Are there any white hairs there in the joint session of Congress who are veterans from World War II, or can tell him that you don't stop at 2 freedoms, there's 4 freedoms, President Bush. And he didn't say a freedom from fear, did he? He didn't say freedom from want, did he? And all the press and all the commentators are saying what a noble and eloquent Churchillian thing it was. And here, before our very eyes, history was being rewritten. A time had passed. And I thought, well, us historians, now we have to do our job. And we hadn't been doing our job. I'm not saying the British history profs at Yale, caused Bush to mess up in the 4 freedoms. Because the 4 freedoms Roosevelt issued during the Blitz, of London in January 1941 at his State of the Union message. And then on his 3rd inaugural, 2 weeks later, the end of January, he said our democratic aspirations began in the Middle Ages with Magna Carta. So in his mind, Magna Carta and the four freedoms were bound together. And I thought, well, now it's the time for us to find out, what does Magna Carta mean for us now? And we have to struggle to make it. I was in Runnymede last week. That's the island in the Thames I was referring to. And the American Bar Association has put a monument there. It's a lovely rotunda, and in the middle is a plinth. It's kind of like a, is that camera on? Imagine a finger up. It's like a phallic symbol. And on that symbol is a star against a blue field, which has no semiotic meanings in England. But to us here in Seattle, it's the blue skies of the U.S. Air Force. That's the insignia. The bombers are there at Runnymede, backed by the ABA. And then beneath the bombers, beneath the star, are the words, "In commemoration of Magna Carta, symbol of freedom under law." What? Even in first year, I told you I didn't read Magna Carta, but they said that it was the king under law back when I was in college. And Stubbs, the Victorian historian, says it. You can't get much more reactionary than him. He said it's the king under law. And here's the ABA, 1957, saying it's freedom under law. This is not true. This is not true at all. This is false. The person of the ABA who put it there was named Rhine. He advised Eisenhower. And they put "In God We Trust" on the money at that time, 1957. And also this same Rhine changed May Day into Law Day. So this is something we need to reverse, lawyers. There can be an alliance of historians and lawyers, and that monument must come down. And what I propose, I'm not for a debate, is that perhaps if the National Lawyers Guild, in a moment of idleness and wishes to engage in antiquarian correction, we can remove that and put instead "Widows reasonable estovers in the common." To do this, however, I think we're going to have to go up against, now I'm betraying up against the sisterhood, as the CIA used to be called in the 1950s by those in government, because I think the CIA had its hand in this. They certainly organized the British magazines at the time. You remember Encounter and whatnot, and they were responsible for bankrolling abstract and expressionism and so on. But when I went to the ABA archives, in Chicago, they wouldn't give me the accounting because it would cost something to put the plinth up. I couldn't really find out who paid or how the money was raised or whether the CIA in fact was involved. It may not have been involved. My case doesn't rest on that. Do I have a few more minutes? Thank you, kind host. May I take another minute or two? Okay. This is the bicentennial this year of Tom Paine's death. And so I've been rereading him. And we all know Common Sense of January 1776. That's when Tom Paine called for a Magna Carta for the 13 colonies. Those were his words. He said, That was his way of declaring independence. At that time when, and the proceeds for that he gave to buy mittens for the soldiers. He called for that. And he was, I was saying, born the year that big sturgeon was found. Remember that big thing? Because his dad was a Quaker, and they were no respecter of persons, in the old phrase. They had a belief that the equality and divinity was within. But his mom, on the other hand, was Anglican. It was not a marriage of convenience, it was a marriage, a perfectly happy one, I think, Tom Paine's parents. But her great uncle was named Charles Cook. Charles George Cock. C-O-C-K-E. And he wrote in 1651. Remember, that's 2 years, isn't it, after Charles Stuart had his head chopped off. Mr. Charles Stuart, as Tom Paine might say, King Charles I, as the British historians say. He was beheaded, and the ruling classes of Europe were never the same afterwards, because it showed that the rulers were merely mortals. And if they had trousers, they would have put them on one leg at a time. They had tights. Well, Tom Paine's ancestor wrote a book called English Law, The Household of God on Earth, referring to Magna Carta as the beginnings of that freedom which the subjects of these times breathed after. Ooh, I didn't mean that to sound fierce. I wanted that to sound the beginnings of that freedom which the subjects of these times breathed after. And then a bit later he wrote, the English now long and thirst after a rational, settled law in all parts of the whole body, taking the law of God for the rule, as a charter granter did, though the face of man was the visible engine to draw the pleasant streams of liberty out of the ocean of royal power. Man. This is why when you refer to Kant today, this man sees justice in the body. He's writing of the face as an engine to draw streams of liberty from the oceans of power. Tom Paine's mother's ancestors breathed for freedom. They longed and thirsted for a commons. Steve, this isn't even levelers and diggers. I found this bit of writing. That's what we historians do. It's human, this longing, this thirst for justice. Okay, that's clear enough. Here's the poem, because I want us to have this poem, and I think we can all learn it, and you probably already know it. I have to look at it. I'm nervous. It's, Mark, man, we should make a tune. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but lets the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. I want us to remember this as the Chink Principle. You know, we have a class society. We refer to capitalism as a class society. Let's do it again. It's less important that we memorize it than we understand it. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but lets the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. Want to try it? The law locks up the man or woman from off the common, but lets the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. So I don't think we can talk about the commons without also talking about locking up. Do you follow? I mean, besides the environmentalism and the programming, our prisons are, there's a relationship. And our work today, I think, is to partly to understand that relationship and to bring it to an end. And Magna Carta is with us. All right, thank you.